So today we're going to talk about Kubernetes service. First and foremost, let's take a look at its description. So basically, a service is nothing more than a network abstraction that allows us to have a common policy to address one or more pods, right? By providing a single IP address for them or a single DNS name. Let's start simple. We have a small web app which is already containerized. It runs on port 8888. It looks something like this. This is our web application. It exposes this HTML page, and for us the next step is to deploy it in Kubernetes. For that purpose, I'm going to create a deployment. Let's call it app, and of course our image, we're going to specify the image that contains our small web application. We can see now that we've successfully deployed the application. We have a pod, and of course we have a deployment as well. Now, an important thing in Kubernetes is that each pod gets its own unique IP address within the cluster, and pods can communicate between them being on the same node or on different nodes without any address translation. Let's see if we can reach our application within the cluster by creating a new pod. We're going to create a naked pod, meaning a pod without any controller. We would like to have a URL binary within the pod. We have an interactive session within the pod, and we're going to use the IP of our application, of the pod of our application, and we know that it runs on port 8888. So we can see that we successfully reach our application. Now, what happens if our application crashes? We can simulate this by deleting our application pod. And of course, due to the replication controller, because we had the deployment and a replication controller behind the scenes, we can see that Kubernetes is actually spinning a new pod instead. And as we said, each pod gets its a new unique IP address, and here the new pod has another IP address. Therefore, our mechanism of reaching our application using the pod IP is not very consistent, and that's why Kubernetes provides the service object. So coming back, we have our deployment. We can use also an imperative approach to create a service by exposing our deployment, which is called app. Let's specify a name for our service. Let's call it app service. And last but not least, we can play a little bit with the ports. We want to run it on port 8080, and of course we know that our application runs on port 8888. And here it's actually port, not target, port. And now we can see that we have our service created. So once more, if we do a kubectl get services, we have our service with this IP and our new port 8080. Now if we enter once more in our CRL pod, we can use the IP provided by the service to reach our application, and now we know that it's on port 8080. We can see that we successfully reach the application. One important note is that the default service is of type cluster IP, since we didn't specify that we want another type of service. And also a nice thing that our service provides is the fact that we have a DNS entry for our IP. In our case, we use the core DNS default DNS server, the DNS system within the cluster. And if we would like to reach our application without using the IP of the service, we can do something like the name of the service. So we know it's app service. We need to specify the namespace. We know that it runs in the default namespace, and of course here we're going to use cluster local because we are running on our local cluster. and as we can see, it's being solved and we can reach our application. So this is another nice thing about services. Even more, if we delete our service, so we know that it's cluster IP, but we can delete service, app service, and we can create it once more, but we can specify right now the type of the service as being load balancer. Type load balancer. Oh, another typo. And now coming back, if we get services once more, we can see that the type is load balancer, so it's no longer cluster IP. And since I have a local cluster, we can reach our service on the new port. So here, if we refresh, it doesn't work, but if we use port 8080, we can see that we've successfully reached our application. So basically, this is the high level gist of services. Last but not least, don't forget to explain the object and take a look at different fields and different specs of this object.